Today is July 15th in the year 2008. I'm Karen Herman with the Archive of American Television. It's my great pleasure today to be interviewing Millie Moore here at her home in Los Angeles, California, as part of a joint interview with ACE.
I'm ever gonna be.
Okay, so we're going to start right from the top, and our first question is, what was your name at birth?
Same as it is now, Mildred Moore.
Do you have a middle name?
I do, Irene. I just don't use it.
Oh, okay. When were you born?
1928,
What was the date?
December the 3rd,
Where?
in Ohio.
Oh, where?
Pardon?
Where in Ohio?
East Liverpool, Ohio.
And what was your father's name?
Clarence.
What did he do?
He had a franchise on jukeboxes with Wurlitzer when they first came out.
Did you have one in your house?
Only when they were broken. However, we did have every record that was ever pressed.
Were you personally into music at the time, as a kid?
Not really, other than we grew up dancing.
And your mother, what was her name?
Dorothy.
Did she work?
Yes, she had her own business.
What did she do?
Oh dear, that's a hard one to explain. She, I don't know even where to begin with this. She organized groups and then had blanket clubs. And so, like she'd go to the WPA and all sorts of religious groups and women of the foreign wars and just all sorts of things to provide women with household items. Because, see, this was just, she started in the mid-30s, so it was right after the Depression. And a lot of people didn't have all these typical, usual household items. And she started this business.
Did you have any brothers or sisters?
I have two sisters, one older and one younger.
And growing up, what kind of hobbies did you have?
What kind of a...
Hobbies. What did you like to do as a kid?
Oh, my mother never saw us from sun up to sunset, other than to come home and eat. Because we were living in Ohio then, and we just raced all over every place and played all over everywhere, and would climb into the hills in the wintertime to go ice skating up in the pond and come home like little icebergs. We'd be just frozen from the waist down from trekking through snow, and did all the usual things, riding bicycles, skating, playing kick the can, you name it, we did it. Played football, baseball, just we're constantly active.
Did you know what you wanted to be when you grew up?
No.
Did you have any idea about, were you involved in entertainment at all? Did you go to movies and listen to the radio?
Oh yeah, grew up going to the Saturday matinees and spending the entire day there. Because at that time, they'd just run 2 or 3 films. Saw all the good horror films, saw the Lon Chaneys and the Boris Karloffs and all the cowboy westerns.
Were you cognizant of the actual editing and the production that went into film?
Not as a kid, no, not at all.
Do you remember the first time that you saw television?
No, I have no idea.
And what high school did you attend?
I went to 3 different high schools in 4 years. I went to 2 high schools in Ohio. Actually, 3 high schools in Ohio and 1 out here in California. I went to Hoover High School in Glendale.
What prompted your move to Los Angeles?
Oh, I had my younger sister was very ill all her life, and the doctors advised that we get her out of that weather, and so I ended up coming to California.
And what did you think of it when you moved out here?
I thought it was very ugly, because Ohio is very beautiful and very, very green. And so when I first got to California, I thought, this is the ugliest place in the world, because it's so dry and so arid, and there's no greenery like what you see in Ohio.
And what kept you here?
Oh, once we moved here, we pretty much stayed here. Well, that's not quite true. When we moved here, within a year, my mother bought another business back in Ohio. So I ended up commuting back and forth because it was a seasonal business. And so we'd go back there for the winters, which is why then I went back there again to go to my senior year in high school in Ohio. And we would then come back in the summer and drive, and then go back in the winter.
What did you do after you graduated from high school?
Well, I eventually became a still photographer.
Did you go to college?
I started out at Glendale Community, and then I went to the Art Center and became a photographer. In the meantime, spent my evenings actually working in the Little Theater.
Doing what?
As a stage manager.
Did you have a preference between stage managing or photography? Was there one that was calling you more than the other?
No, originally I really enjoyed being a still photographer, and I loved working in the theater.
What brought you to the theater?
I had a friend who worked there, and she invited me when she was working on a play, and I got involved.
Did you do many productions?
Yeah, but I have no idea what they were.
How long did you do that?
Oh, probably 2 or 3 years, because then I took off for Europe and ended up living there for a couple of years before I came back.
How did you support yourself?
However I could. Actually, I worked at a coffee shop. I sold newspapers under the Eiffel Tower, and I ended up working in a theater in London.
Okay, then you came back here.
Well, yes. Then I came back home finally, but that's where while I was in London is when I got my, should I say, my first taste of documentary filmmaking. Because while I was working in the theater, I ran into a young Italian woman who was a director on a grant from Italy, making documentaries. And she was just finishing up the one when I met her and was getting ready to go and do some research on another film that she wanted to do on the Teddy Boys of London. And so she asked me if I'd be interested to help her, because she thought the two of us, being one very good-looking young Italian woman and a young American woman from Hollywood, would really open the doors for us to be able to associate with the Teddy Boys, and to be able then to really find out about their culture and where they were coming from. And neither one of us seemed to worry about the risk, because Teddy Boys were bad news. They were chain-carrying, knife-carrying hoods. So it was fascinating, and that was when I first, as I said, got involved with documentary film, and I think that's when I got bitten by the bug.
So what did you do on that film exactly?
Well, we used to go out every night and sit and talk with all these guys and hang out where they were hanging out, and basically that's the most that I did on it. I didn't ever really get involved in the shooting of it, but I saw the excitement of really being able to make documentary films.
Did you have a credit on it?
No, I don't think so. I'm not aware of it. So when I came back home, I went into fashion photography and wasn't particularly fond of it. And a friend of mine who worked at Disney's told me he was going to take a class and wanted to know if I wanted to join him. Vorkapich, the famous effects director, was in town giving a class. And so I said, oh yeah, love to go take a class from Vorkapich, And so the two of us went to the class, and that's where I met then a young gentleman who worked for a television producer making documentaries. And he told me they were looking for a researcher because they were going to start, they wanted to start a new series And so they needed someone to do a lot of research for them. And so that was my beginning in motion picture.
And what was that series that you worked on?
Well, it was a production by Jack Douglas. And at this moment, the name of the series fails me. But what we did was we shot film all around the world of indigenous cultures. And so we had crews that went all over every place. And what I did was do the research to find what I felt was, interesting places to go and shoot their cultures. And then I'd give them to Jack, and we'd discuss them, and he'd pick what where we wanted to send the crews.
Did you? Okay, we're back on. Okay, you were talking about working on that documentary. Now, did you get to see the footage after it came back?
Yes, actually, that was one of my first jobs to do. Was I screened all footage that was shot and evaluated it technically to make sure that we felt it was up to the quality we were looking for. Eventually, I really started actually also in judging the content of it. And I worked for Jack several years, held many positions in his organization, because this was not the only TV show that he did. He did several other ones, but I was only affiliated with this one particular series. Eventually, he wanted me to become a producer, and I turned it down because that meant traveling 9 months out of 12, living out of a suitcase. And I didn't really want to do that. And by this time, I really had spent a lot of time associating with the editorial department. And I said, no, I really would like to move over into the editorial department. And so I knew all the fellas very well, and they knew me, and in some ways I had been partially responsible for hiring several of them. So we were all good buddies. So they had no problem with having a woman come into the editing room. And that was where then I fell in love with editing.
And what attracted you to it?
Well, because I was so familiar with their problems and their challenges to make these films something more exciting and slightly different, and rather than just a plain travelogue. And because I screened all the footage and had all the connections with the crews that were around the world, the editors used to come to me and tell me all of their problems about trying to get these shows together. And so, because they knew that I talked them to the crews. And so then I would talk to the crews and make suggestions about how maybe they could cover certain things for us. And eventually I realized that as far as I was concerned, films were made in the editing room. And so that's what I suppose attracted to me the most.
Talk about that. What was your learning curve once you got into the room?
Well, I was fairly knowledgeable to begin with, but the one thing the fellows told me was that, of course, I would have to join, the union, because it was a union shop. And by joining the union, which meant I served for 8 years as an assistant, and all the guys all said, "Oh, it'll be a piece of cake with your background. Union will just, you'll just walk in and they'll say yeah," which of course didn't turn out that way at all, because at that time, women were not looked upon too kindly in the editing union, and if a woman wanted to join, they were just automatically shipped off to film libraries. Where in my case, the head of the union knew who I was, because I was also sometimes involved in hiring of editors, and so they knew very well that when I wanted to join the union, I wanted to be an editor. So it ended up being a bit of a battle, should we say, of having fights with them about accepting me into the union.
Now, did you have to do that yourself, or did you have people on your side that were?
No, I did basically for myself because, Jack Douglas was not that well looked upon. He did documentaries. This wasn't the motion picture industry. And at that time, if I remember right, there were only 12 women editors in the union. And most of them had, or should I say several, had gotten, who had a lot more influential, should I say, friends and families, and managed to get in, and had been in for several years. So, it was all the old-time women that you hear about, like Adrian Fazan and Dorothy Spencer and Maggie Booth and this sort of thing, who, as I said, had been in the union for quite some time.
So what was it that finally got you in? What was the final push?
I just didn't give up, because I told him, hey, I'm going to become a editor, and I will either do it with you or without you. But you're not going to stop me. They managed to lose my initial job, or my application. Oh no! What, you filled out an application? Well, we don't seem to have it. You have to fill out another one. Several months would go by, and I had to fill out another one. But they just, the guy, the head of it, I guess finally decided that it was a waste of time fighting with me about it.
Was there a point that you saw that women were now being accepted into the union without a problem, without this fight?
Well, yes, especially after the studios fell apart. There were a lot of women in the union, but they were all librarians. And once the studios started falling apart and closing up all of the libraries, there were all these women that were in the editors' union, had been for many years, and so consequently had to be accepted as becoming assistants.
And talk about your assistantship. You for 8 years,
Mm-hmm.
you were an assistant. Were you always with the Douglas Company? Or?
No. After I moved into editing, Jack, due to a family tragedy, closed up his business. And so I was out in the world then of Hollywood. And it just so happened that year there was a big shortage of assistant editors. And so I managed to get a job at Paramount without any sort of hozzerai and was shipped off to work with Sid Levin, who then I spent most of my assistantship with him, and he willingly and graciously taught me the craft of editing, and suffered all of the insults and pressure of what was he doing working with a woman, and he didn't care. And so, as I say, he really was my mentor.
What's the most important thing you learned from him?
How to cut a film properly. Other than just that, I don't, in general.
What were some of the films that you worked on with him?
Oh, goodness. I don't remember the names of them. Yeah. But as I say, I spent most of my assistantship with him and most of my 8 years with him.
And then how did you move to becoming an editor in full?
Well, I was unemployed at the time. Sid and I had finished a feature that he was doing, and I was unemployed. And a friend of mine from documentaries, from Jack Douglas's, called me, told me he was going to be producing a film because we were all out of work. We all shifted jobs. And so he said he was going to do a feature film, and they were setting up their editing department, and would I like to come in for an interview with the director? So I of course, asked him, well, what's the film and who's the director? And, of course, once he told me it was Johnny Got His Gun and it was Dalton Trumbo, I literally told him that I would pay him to let me work on that film because I had read the book as a teenager and was very, once you read that book, you don't ever forget it. And I also then knew very much Dalton Trumbo's history in Hollywood. So I knew exactly who I was dealing with on that level. And so I went in for an interview, and Dalton and I just hit it off right from the beginning. And eventually, then I became the editor.
Well, talk a little bit about him personally and professionally.
Oh,
how you worked together.
Great human being. I just adored him. Very, very kind, gentleman that was just a joy to know. So.
Did you talk about his earlier years
Pardon?
in Hollywood? Did you talk about his earlier years in Hollywood?
Very seldomly. He really wasn't prone to really talk about it. I know he told me that he would do it again if he had to. That he really wasn't unhappy about the fact that he had been sent to prison and that he had been absolutely ruined in Hollywood. And however, on the other hand, he really wasn't ruined in Hollywood because he did a lot of work under, pseudonyms. And I think he was the first person, I may be wrong about that, but I think he was the first person who refused to accept an Academy Award because the film he wrote was under pseudonym. And of course, everybody in Hollywood knew he had written it, but they still offered it under the pseudonym. And so he wouldn't accept it. So.
Talk about working with him as an editor.
Oh, he was a delight to work with. Just wonderful. And we would discuss, because as he was shooting, because he wasn't a director. This was the first time he had ever directed. So he, of course, made all the typical mistakes a first-time director makes. So we had a lot of conversations. And in the meantime, he wrote a lot of the voiceover dialogue as he went along. But the film was absolutely devastating to cut because all of the voiceover, when I was cutting it, was his voice. Because he, as they would shoot Johnny in bed, to get him in the mood of what he was, the little he could do, Dalton would sit right next to him and read all of the emotions that he would later then, do in a dubbing session. And Dalton could read his own work almost better than any writer I've ever heard. I mean, he was unbelievable when he read all this stuff. So I'd start to cut a scene, hearing all this terrible, gut-wrenching dialogue, and I'd start to cry. And I'd have to get up and walk around the block, get calmed back down again, before I could go on and continue on with the scenes. Because it was just, it was a hard film. It was emotionally, hard. It was really devastating.
Did Dalton give you a lot of direction in terms of the cutting itself? Was he in the room with you?
No, not at all. No. He knew I knew where he was coming from. I knew what he wanted.
Do you think you gave it to him?
Yes. As best I could, I must say, this was my very, very first film as an editor. And to this day, God bless him, that he trusted me enough to allow me to be the editor on it.
How was it received once it was all cut?
Well, internationally, it was received very well. In this country, a lot of people couldn't stand it. I mean, they would get up and walk out of the theater because it was too devastating. It was too hard, too tough to watch. But it wasn't badly received here, but most of its awards came from foreign countries. Because we got 2 awards at the Cannes Film Festival and got awards at several other countries.
What did that film do for your career?
Pardon?
What did that film do for your career? That's that.
Well, I don't really know, to tell you the truth, how much it did for my career. I know that between that film and my second film, it left me feeling like, well, this is sort of the top of the heap, you know, and where do I go from here?
What was your second film?
Well, that was The Man Who Skied Down Everest, which won, the Oscar for the best feature film of the year. And so it was rather frightening to start this career with two films that were such successes.
We'll talk a little bit about The Man Who Skied Down Everest. How did you get that job?
I knew had a Canadian producer, brought it to this, and the film itself was shot as a scientific expedition. The skier managed to get involved with them so that he could trek along with this scientific expedition to go up to the top of Everest, because at that time, just anybody couldn't climb up Everest. I mean, it was all run, by the government, and you were, who decided whether they wanted to issue you a permit or not, to do it. But a Canadian gentleman got hold of all this footage, brought it down to this country, and Larry Schiller got involved with it. And Larry I had worked with before on a couple things. And so he then turned to me and said, I've got all this Canadian, Japanese film, because that's what it was a Japanese expedition, that this Canadian producer wants to turn it into a documentary on the skier. And so I ended up with just, I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of feet of film on this whole expedition, that then I proceeded to try to wade through and pull out the footage on the skier and make a story out of it. So I had a big three-headed chem and a moviola and 2 or 3 assistants, and we just started and put like all of the mountain shots on one reel, all of this kind on another reel, and I'd have these 3 plates just going all the time, trying to find footage I was looking for. So it was a monumental task to wade through all of this documentary footage. And it was great, footage, because they had carried their own huge cameras up there. It was not 16 millimeter stuff. This was proper, 35 millimeter footage.
How did you craft the story with so much footage?
Well, I had to think of a concept, first of all, and I had to figure out what's the difference between a documentary and a feature film. And if we want to make this into a feature film, then I have to really approach it from that point of view. I have to have an antagonist and a protagonist to sort of get a story out of this. And so I tended to use the mountains as the adversary. And so I made him, he has to have hated me when he saw the film, because I really made him out to be very self-centered and very selfish, because I would use certain amounts of the expedition, of the scientists, because they tested him frequently to see how he was holding up in comparison to just ordinary people. But I never showed him ever helping out. He never carried a thing. Every time they stopped, all he did was exercise and get prepared for his mission. And so the scientists it was like, well, they came along for the ride, sort of thing. And so that was sort of the concept that I conjured up in my head to give me some guidance in putting this film together and making a story out of it.
Were you happy with the results when it was all over?
Yes. It was the only thing I didn't like. I ended the film by having him ski down Everest, which was a failure, because he fell down. And it was terribly exciting because he landed, maybe 20 feet before a drop-off. That if had he gone down the drop-off, nobody would have ever found him, because it was just this huge cavern that he could have gone down in. And the only thing that saved him was his parachute, because on the way down, his parachute got slowed down by getting caught up on a big boulder. But anyway, when he finally stopped, he just lay there, and nobody knew whether he was dead or alive. And finally, all of a sudden, he raised his hand and swung his pole. And I ended the show there. When they took it up back up to Canada, where it was going to be dubbed and all this sort of thing, the producer obviously didn't like ending it there, because there was a lot of footage of them then trekking across the ice to go and rescue him and bring him back. And so they added all that to it. I thought it was more exciting, because the other thing that I sort of always thought about was, I can't think of the mythological character who put the wings on and flew to the sun and got too close. Right. And that was the other thing that was sort of in the back of my head, was that he dared to challenge God and failed. Which is why, I guess, made me end it the way I did.
And so where did you go from there? I mean, like you said, you'd cut these two really high-profile films.
Well, I think maybe my next film was the Great Texas Dynamite Chase. I'm not sure if that's quite the right name, because I know they changed it, for Michael Pressman. And that was his very first film. And so we hit it off like two little peas in the pod. And from that point on, I cut several films for Michael. And, one film just led to another. And I know, as I say, I had worked with Schiller, and he had asked me then to cut a TV show for him. And, you just start getting to know more and more people. But I suppose I worked most on more films, should I say, with Michael Pressman than anybody.
Well, we'll talk about that relationship, the relationship between a director and the editor. How did you two work it out? And is there sort of a general format, or is every relationship very different?
Well, I think you have to have, in some ways, like minds, so that you're sort of both coming from the same place, of understanding what's in the story. Because the other thing I always tried, not always successful, but whenever I got asked to do a show, the first thing I wanted to do was meet with the director, read the script, and then meet with the director and go over the script and find out where he was coming from, where I was coming from, and whether we collectively thought any of the script needed to be jiggled a little here or there, And in doing that, and having those kinds of conversations with the director, you really find out if each other, if the two of you are going to be able to see eye to eye on what should happen in a film, how to make the dramatic moments. And I know one of my big concerns has always been being as faithful to the writer as I could, because that's where it is. That's where it starts. That's where it is. Without a good script, you don't have anything. And so I always, no matter what I did to manipulate scenes, I was always conscious of trying to be true to the writer's intent. So.
Did you ever have discussions with writers, or was it all about?
I have indeed had them, in having discussions with the directors, we've also sometimes brought in writers and made suggestions as to changing scripts. Adding this or taking that out, or this is a little, this is really redundant. We really don't need to do this scene again. Can we do this, move on in some other direction?
And what about the visual aspects of the work in terms of working with the director?
Other than being concerned about transitions and how he was going to deal with transitions, I didn't ever. I didn't, for the most part, get involved too much with that. I know with Larry Schiller, the film I did with him, it was a 2-character film about a couple who had crashed in northern Canada. And so the entire show was pretty much just the two of them in the wilds. And I know that I talked to him about needing to go and see film like, I think it was Heaven Only Knows Mr. Allison. That was a 2-character film on an island during the war with, was it Robert Mitchum and Deborah Carr? And it was just the two of them. And so, I said, hey, I think we need to go and see this, because when you deal with 2 characters and that's all, and a very, very limited location, you don't want the film to end up being a ping pong game. And it can very well happen that way. So we really have to take a lot of consideration about what kind of camera angles, what size of the shots. If we don't want to just do close up, close up, close up, close up. If you're shooting over the shoulder on one person, close up on the other person, switch around, do a broader shot from the other person, and really do a lot of movement with the camera, since you don't have movement of area. So, which is why, to me, the last television show I did, Gil Cates, that was a 2-character in literally one room, and there was never anything boring about, at least I don't think, the cutting of it, because he really used a lot of different camera angles, kept the camera moving, kept them moving within this confines of one room. I love doing 2-character films because it's really very challenging from all aspects.
Now, would you ever go to the sets of these films?
Rarely ever. You're cutting, day for day. So you don't have any time to go to the set. They shoot one day, you cut it the next. And so what they're shooting that day, you cut the next. So you don't have any time to be running around the sets.
So would you be basically, in terms of working with a director, how closely would you work with the director in terms of, would they ever call you while they were shooting and say, ask you questions or anything like that?
Not usually. On occasion I've had calls, sure, but where it really, because, I come from the day where we looked at dailies in a theater. And so every night, we would sit down together then and screen the dailies and do all the discussions then. Or like when I worked on Go Tell the Spartans, they were shooting it out at Magic Mountain, I think, isn't that out in the valley?
That's Valencia, that area?
Yeah. And so every night, I was here in town cutting, and every night I'd take the dailies and drive them out to Valencia and sit down with Ted Post and screen all the dailies out there with him, and then drive back home and cut the stuff the next day.
What would be the general, the way that you, once you screen the dailies, how would the discussions go about what would be the next steps for you?
Well, we would just discuss what he shot, and what they thought were the best takes. And I always, of course, had an assistant with me, And my assistant used to have to sit there and just do nothing but write down our entire conversations all the time and never open their mouths, just sit there and take notes on everything, you know. And we would, you know, just, I think that's the typical thing that you do. When the director tells you what takes they like, they tell you why they did this or why they did that. And then sometimes I'd go back to my editing room and use the takes they said they liked, and sometimes I wouldn't, you know, because once you start putting the film together, things sort of change, you know. And so you would keep your fingers crossed that when the director finally looked at it when it was all done, there wouldn't be a big problem about what takes you used and what ones you didn't take that he had picked.
Were there often actors in those daily sessions as well?
Rarely in features did we ever have anybody in that room except the director and me and my assistant. Now then, you know, I mean, I've had occasions where I've worked on films with, say, like with Michael. I can remember Frank Langella used to always want to come to the screenings, and Michael would let him. But it was the director's decision most of the time. The director could either say yes or no. You can come to the screenings, or maybe you can't come to the screenings.
Do you remember your first film for television?
I think it was the film I did with Larry Schiller, Hey, I'm Alive. I'm not quite sure, but I think that was the first one.
Now, was there a difference in cutting for television as opposed to feature?
Well, as far as I was concerned, no. I mean, I approached the television show, because most of the television shows I did were, you know, what were used to be movies of the week. And I approached them the same way I did a feature.
Did you have to take into account advertising breaks, things like that, pacing in terms of...
Well, yeah, I guess. I mean, you always had to cut it so that you could have a stopping point, so that you could have a commercial, yeah.
And did you see a lot of network executives and people other than the director more for television?
Well, that to me was the biggest difference, was you were then having to deal with frequently not just a producer, but several executive producers, associate producers, you know, just down the line, a lot. So that was the biggest difference, I think.
What kind of notes would you be getting from them? Was there something that you kind of always would see or hear?
Well, the funniest one I had, should I say, we were screening the film, the Crossings, and it was in the screening room, and it was a big ballroom scene, and one of the producers was unhappy about the fact that the lead, I hope I've got the right film, the lead actor came to the ball without a vest on underneath his lovely, you know, early American clothes, and said absolutely no gentleman would ever come to this kind of a big ball without having a proper vest on, and wanted me to take the footage back to the editing room and get the vest on him. And so the director looked at me and he nudges me a bit and he says, "It's all yours, Millie." He just sat there and didn't open his mouth. And so I had to have this whole conversation with this producer who insisted upon I had to have a vest on this man. And it took me a while to convince him that it just hadn't been shot that way, and I did not have that footage. It wasn't that I chose a take where he wasn't wearing the vest. I could not go in those days and put a vest on him. Now, in today's world, we could have taken it back into the editing room, gotten a little digital thing, and maybe managed to put a vest on him. but in those days it was sort of rather difficult to do.
And you eventually backed down on that? Or?
Well, there was no choice. You know, there wasn't anything I could do. There wasn't anything anybody, unless you wanted to reshoot the scene. Which is, I think, is probably what I told him in the end. Was, well, if you want to go back and reshoot that whole thing, we can make sure he's got a vest on.
Let's talk about some of the other films that you worked on. Strangers, the story of a mother and daughter.
Oh, great film. You know, I mean, you can't go wrong with Betty Davis and Jennifer Lawrence. You know, I mean, two just beautiful, beautiful actresses. So I love doing it. Good story, you know, and good, you know, well directed, and had fun doing it.
One of the notable things you did, which was a little bit out of the realm, was Cagney and Lacey.
Oh yeah. Well, that I didn't normally do episodics, you know, but just happened to know the producer, and it was at the end of the season, and several of the editors, you know, were leaving the show to go on to other things, and they had one more show to do, and he called me up and wanted to know what I was up to, and I told him I was in between jobs, and asked me if I would do him a favor and come in and cut this one episode of Cagney and Lacey. So I said, sure, why not? So that's how it was a
very notable episode. Can you describe it? Called Choices?
It had to do with her being pregnant, or thinking she was being pregnant. Other than that, I can't remember too much about it.
Now, that was an episodic show. Was that different for you?
No, because there again, I mean, I was so attuned into features, I basically approached anything I cut from the same sort of standards and looking for the same things. And
were you familiar with the show?
No, I don't think I'd ever seen it. But, you know, I looked after I got the job at some show, you know, some of the series to see what was going on in it.
Did that help you? I mean, in the sense that the characters were already kind of in full bloom at that point, and had their own tics. And
right. Well, yeah. Well, that, you know, and I must say, I mean, they were both, you know, good characters. I loved them both, you know, and it was well directed. And I must say, then I did indeed cut another film for Karen Arthur, who was the director on that particular episode.
Okay, what film was that?
Crossings, which was I think involved 3 episodes, I think, for Aaron Spelling.
And you also worked with her on the rape of Richard Beck.
Yes, and I knew, you know, there was another that I worked with her.
Yeah. Can you talk about that?
Well, that was, I felt, a very, very effective film, and of course I enjoyed very much, given the fact that it had to do with rape. You know? And I don't know that I've ever seen another film that had to do with male rape rather than females. And so, and that was the whole story of showing a policeman who was used to seeing women raped and thinking of nothing about going to the hospital and watching them have to go through a rape kit and all of the humiliation of it. And it was the sort of, you know, this very familiar attitude of, well, you know, what was she doing there at that given place at that time, and how was she dressed, and, you know, this sort of thing. And a real wisecracking policeman, but real gun-ho. And so one night he gets himself in trouble by following a couple of thugs down into the underground of Seattle, you know, which is a rather frightening thing to go down into that underground. If you've ever been in it, to go down there by yourself at nighttime, I wouldn't want to do it. And of course runs into these 2 thugs. And of course they grab him and find out he's a policeman. And they say, oh, perfect. perfect. What can we do to this man, being a policeman, to make him keep his mouth shut? So they rape him. You know? And this then eventually, changes this particular policeman's attitude totally about rape and how it can happen. And yes, maybe he shouldn't have been down there, but you can't blame him that he really becomes the victim. And so that was the whole story, was about him and how he handled the rape and the humiliation, and how his father was furious with him to think that he would allow such a thing. It was obviously your fault because you permitted it to happen. So all the old cliches about women.
That's interesting too, that you have a woman director and a woman editor.
Yeah.
Was that notable in that sense?
Well, yeah, I think we probably both enjoyed it very much from its message.
And what about from an editorial standpoint? I mean, putting this on television, this is kind of an issue on television. From an editorial standpoint, how did you do it to make it available for standards and practices?
Well, of course, I didn't actually. We didn't cut, the rape itself. I mean, it was implied. And we showed them, grabbing him and mugging him and jostling back and forth about what they were going to do with him, and using language like. What did the guy say? Said something to his buddy. Did you ever hear a pig squeal? They only squeal when you stab them. I mean, how much more do you have to say? As he's hanging onto this policeman by the neck.
And how was the film received?
Oh, I think very well. I think it was nominated for.
You think you won an Eddie Award for it, actually?
Yes, I think. I may have won the Eddie Award. And I must say, on this film, the assistant I had, who I had for many years, because he was sort of following the same pattern that I had followed with Sid, he followed the same pattern with me. And by that time, he had put in, because I always believe in allowing my assistants to cut at least a scene in any film I work on. And he had cut many a scene for me. And so I allowed him to cut a couple of scenes in this film, and actually I gave him then film credit because he was finishing his 8 years, and I really wanted to help him get in, to become an editor.
What was his name?
God, I haven't seen him in 1,000 years. I think I'm having memory loss. Maury Beck. And so I gave him the credit as second editor on it.
A film that you did in 1988 was To Heal a Nation.
Oh, yeah. Well, given as political as I am, that was a fun film to do because it was all about getting the Vietnam Wall built. And so it was about all of the politics that went on and all of the discord and people who didn't want to build and how insulted people were that they were going to make this big black wall. They wanted something to be proud of and some big statue. They didn't want a black wall. And then on top of all that, it was being designed by an Oriental person and a woman at that. So it was a very interesting film, very interesting story of how all of the turmoil that went on to get it built, and then how the Americans accepted it. And it, I must say, as far as I'm concerned, is just unbelievably moving to go up to that wall and run your hands across it.
Was it an editorial challenge for you?
Yes. We had, why? Why did we have so much different kind of footage? We had 16 millimeter, 35 millimeter, and all kinds of stock footage, and because we showed part of it being built and things. So this was all just stock. It wasn't something that we shot, that Michael shot. So we had a whole combination of different kinds of film to deal with, and a lot of library searching to find stock footage that was applicable for this whole thing. And so from that point of view, technically, it was difficult to handle.
Another film you did was 10th Man in 1988.
Yeah. That was a short story of Graham and Greene about the French in the Second World War. And about a impersonator who was a, let's see, I don't know how to say this story, wealthy French man who ends up in a German prison in Paris. And this woman, and so he loses everything, and he had been very wealthy, so they had this beautiful home, and this he got out of prison. Oh goodness, it's been so long since I did this film, and so long since I've read the story. I can't remember how it is, of why it was called The 10th Man, because it had to do with like a lottery. And he picked, like, I know the Germans used to come into the prison every day and kill so many prisoners. And so they had come to the group, the cell block that he was in, and said, okay, we're going to come in and kill the 10th man. And you guys pick whoever you want as the 10th man, because we're going to kill him. And so they drew straws as to who would get killed. And the actor's name who played the role, I can't think of it at the moment. They took, he drew the 10th straw. And so he knew he was going to get killed. In the meantime, there was a young boy there who was coughing up blood, who obviously was tubercular and who was dying. And he said, no, let me take the straw. I will be the 10th man, because I know I'm going to die anyway. So he took the straw. And in the meantime, then, the actor gets out of prison, goes back to his home, and there's a young woman and an older woman living in the house. And so everything was all right. And, oh, good, you're asking me something I can't remember. I know a gentleman comes to the door and introduces himself. Oh, that's what it was. The guy who owns the house doesn't come back to the house. He just comes back to the property. And he doesn't go into the house, and he doesn't introduce who he is. And all of a sudden comes this other gentleman who knocks on the door and says that he is the original owner of this house. And he's really an imposter. And so the story then evolves from there, finding out who the imposter is. But a good story. Good story. And a good director, whose name I'm trying to think of, who was a British director. Very good director.
Well, let's stop here and change the tape.